A, I know that you do the cryptids research, and I know that David is brilliant at that also. But what drew your interest to things like, to come from ufology to the Bigfoot phenomenon? And I know there's theories out now that these things are interrelated, and is it possible that all of the things that are happening are interdimensional and they just bebop and string is involved with all this? And how did you get there, and what is your take on that?
Well, as far as my take's concerned, I mean, there's no doubt that, John Keel, way back in the 60s, sort of pointed out that there seemed to be a lot of similarities and crossovers between certain cryptozoological creatures and the world of the paranormal and world of UFOs. Where he talked about how people had seen UFO activity in the same time frame and location as strange creatures like lake monsters and things like that, and Bigfoot type creatures. And Keel came to believe that all of these phenomena were completely interactive with each other. Now, I'm not sure I think everything is interconnected, but I think he did make a good case that some of these crypto creatures are weirder than they seem to be, that they're not necessarily just unknown animals. They could be something more paranormal based or interdimensional. But how I got involved in cryptozoology was that, I mentioned earlier about how I started reading books by people like John Keel and Charles Berlitz and Brad Steiger. And, of course, they didn't just write about UFOs. They wrote about strange creatures as well. Well, Berlitz didn't, but the others did. And so, one of the things that I found was the same that Keel found, that, you'd find parallels. And it turns out that there was one particular little area, a little village just north of me, only about 20 minutes drive, something like that, and a little village called Ranton. And back in 1879, there was this wave of sightings of this strange creature that became known locally as the man monkey, and it was described as like a humanoid figure but covered in hair, and it sort of caused the people in this little village of Ranton to sort of fall into a state of hysteria back in January 1879. And the legends of this story and the sightings sort of persisted. And so when I found out about this story and found out that it actually occurred only like 20 minutes drive away, I went out there, and that was I was probably about 17 or 18 then, and that was actually the first thing I ever investigated as like a paranormal phenomenon. And I went out there and looked into some of the old newspapers in the archives, that kind of thing, and also sort of spoke to some of the locals and who all knew the story because it had just been passed down through the generations. And so that was basically what I did. I found an interesting local story of a Bigfoot type and went knocking on doors, and said, "What do you know about the man monkey?" And that's how it sort of really began for me, with strange creatures.
Were people forthcoming when you asked the questions?
What's that?
Were people willing to speak with you when you showed up at their door?
Well, I didn't quite literally turn up at their front door, but I did sort of, drop into the local store, or the local pub, that kind of thing, or the gas station, and, chat there. Said, I'm, just in the area, just looking into this story. And those people were, very kind of, happy to help. They're like, oh, yeah, my grandfather told me this story about it. And there wasn't too much that was new to add to the story, but there were a few new witnesses that I managed to track down who'd seen this thing years later. And so that was the one that really got me interested in cryptozoology, and the fact that, it was close to where I lived made it, much easier to investigate it. And it was sort of like a, very forested, wooded, sort of almost like a very atmospheric kind of old England type situation, and this strange creature prowling around in the woods. So that's how I really got sort of involved with cryptozoology.
That's interesting. And I had never heard of the man monkey.
Well, I actually did I did a book on the subject, not a long book, only about 120 pages, because it was there just wasn't too much of a story to tell. It stalled after a while. But
I don't know how I missed that. I've read so much of your stuff.
Well, the book's actually called Man Monkey, so
well, I'm going to go look for that.
Easy to remember, but it's basically like I sort of wrote it. Like a diary kind of journal approach, which sort of followed me doing the investigations, and I still get occasional reports today of this creature, which clearly is some sort of supernatural thing, because people have described it sort of vanishing, and then it comes back. It's almost like a spectral type ape-like animal. So, that's sort of what really got me into, following, the John Keel kind of approach to all this.
Well, I know that I have been fascinated. I met some people last year at an event that I believe it was the North American Dogmen group.
Oh, yeah.
And they had this big mounted, if it were real, it would have been a taxidermy, that kind of a thing, of what they had described to them and what they'd experienced. And it was really my first time to see something like that. Of course, I took my photo with it. But I would not actively go into the woods seeking this out. I'm not afraid of ghosts. I've been in touchy situations with spiritual issues. But a friend of mine is a cryptozoologist, and in fact, he'll be with me on Fate Sunday. But I sit there and I look and I'm like, I don't think I want to hunt something that could eat me. That gives me a little bit of a pause when I contemplate it. But have you experienced a dogman, or have you experienced personally an encounter?
Personally, I haven't, but I have actually investigated a number of dogman stories. Now, for people who may not know what the dogman is, it's kind of like the closest modern day thing you could think of to like a werewolf.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're not talking about people like in the movies, bursting out their clothes at a full moon and rampaging around and, killing a bunch of kids in the woods, like in the movies or whatever. Most people, in fact, I would say 99.99% of everyone talks about seeing what looks like a huge wolf-like animal, but which can walk on two limbs and on four limbs. It can predominantly walks on four limbs, but will raise up on its hind legs and can run at speed on its hind legs. So that's why, obviously, you have these sort of parallels with werewolf stories, because it basically looks, imagine like a bear standing up, but having a head like a German shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
That's basically the best way to describe how they look. Now, what's interesting is that, some people believe they saw like an unknown form of wolf, that has genetically altered over the centuries, and we haven't found it. We don't know about it. Other people take the view that, could it be something supernatural? Now, the supernatural angle for the dogman's an interesting one, because a lot of sightings of the dogmen have been made by, for example, particularly in Wisconsin, where most of the reports come from. They've often been seen round these ancient mounds, that you can find these mounds all around Wisconsin. A lot of sightings around there, a lot of sightings around graveyards and cemeteries, and also crossroads and bridges, which are also places which typically have legends of supernatural activity surrounding them. So, there is sort of a large body of people who think these things are somehow supernatural. But I actually personally investigated one of these a couple of years ago. It was a case that actually, the event itself occurred back in 1972 in a town in Ohio called Defiance. And I went out there.
I've been there. That's where they started?
What's that?
I've been there. That's where this started?
No, it didn't start there, but that's actually one of the most famous cases.
I misunderstood you. Wow.
Okay. Yeah, but I went, although the case was the summer of 1972 when this all broke out,
right.
I went out there to the town in 2016 with a couple of friends of mine in cryptozoology, Ken Gerhard and Lyle Blackburn, and we sort of went all around the area, spoke to people, and, the story, as I said, it was 72 when it happened, and we went out in 2016. But
Right.
a lot of the people there, the old-timers remembered it, and it was actually covered deeply by the local papers. And even the local police in Defiance actually opened a file on this werewolf-type sighting. And many of the sightings were made on an old area of railroad track in Defiance, and we actually found the actual piece where the first sighting occurred. But although, you had sort of tales in the newspapers of werewolves, with hindsight today, it sounds like it was a dogman. And the Defiance, if you Google Defiance, Ohio werewolf, you'll actually find a couple of my articles, and you'll also find some older articles and even some transcripts of the original newspaper clippings from the early 70s. So that's sort of like a really interesting, cool case.
That is so neat. And I'm going to tell you that we just blew right back by blah, 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 blah. Easy for me to say. We just blew right by our break, so I'm going to just edit to fix that later because I'm not stopping. But I am so fascinated by that. I have just absolutely been blown away. The place that I had that paranormal experience that I was telling you about is in Paulding, Ohio, which is 17 miles from Defiance. I stay in Defiance when I go there. So,
cool.
It's a small world.
Yeah.
Much smaller for you because you've been all over it. But it's just really an interesting coincidence in my mind.
Well, yeah, if you go there again, I mean, if you check out the old railroad track, you'll find it easy. And, for those people who were alive at the time, it's almost like their Roswell, that Roswell, the town, was made famous by the crash. And even though it's not quite that scale in Defiance, everybody of a certain age, remembers it. So.
Well, I believe I know exactly where that is because I've spent a couple of Saturday mornings roaming around that area. So, holy wow.
Yeah.
That got my attention. Well, I am curious that the difference between dogman research and, well, I'm going to ask you this first about the dogman before we move on. I have been told by people that have experienced them that they are almost, well, not almost, but their communication is telepathic. That when they were coming up to where a group of armed men were, they didn't exhibit fear. They created fear. And that to a person, not one man raised his weapon because they had a strong indication that would not end well for them.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've not personally come across that angle, but there are a lot of weird stories where people saw the dogman and they got this strange vibe that it was sort of not just physically dangerous, but it was sort of like supernaturally evil. They got like this sense of like malevolent sense from it. And there are other cases where, people have seen like strange lights in the sky when the dogman was seen. Not so much like UFOs, but like weird balls of light flying over it and hovering above it. And so, there's certain things that sort of do take the dogman phenomena out of the category of it just being some bizarre kind of strange of wolf. It's
yes.
There's way more to it than that, and a lot of it ties in with Native American legends, of shape-shifting creatures and things like that. So, Linda Godfrey, a good friend of mine, she's written like either 5 or 6 books now on the subject, and because there's so many accounts and so many witnesses who've come forward, it's like a huge phenomenon, really.
Well, I am always fascinated by things like that because it just is so unexpected. is a totally different experience from most Bigfoot stories.